Over the last 20 years, we have seen a ton of busts in the NHL come and go, but today we're going to go through every single draft year from 2005 all the way to now to see who the biggest draft bust is from every single year. So who was the worst of the worst in every single draft, and what can we learn from them today? Well, make sure you watch till the end as we go through every single draft bust, and hit that subscribe button if you're new as well for more hockey content just like this all throughout the offseason. Now we're just going to go through the drafts in recent memory, which starts us all the way back in the 2005 NHL draft, and this was honestly a pretty solid draft all around. You had great talent like Sidney Crosby first overall, but after that, like Anze Kopitar, Paul Stastny, and on the goaltending side, Jonathan Quick, Carey Price, Tuukka Rask. But to me, out of all the draft picks, the worst was 6th overall by the Columbus Blue Jackets when they end up selecting Gilbert Brule. Brule, I think, just came in the wrong era. As a smaller player, he was a much more physical presence than you'd really expect for a player like that, but I think the league wasn't quite ready for one of those players to truly succeed, and especially in Brule's case, he's somebody that was never really able to find a fit with Columbus. Almost immediately was placed as a bottom 6 guy who would play around 10 minutes or so a night, just not enough time to really reach his potential or develop his skill set. He would later get traded to the Edmonton Oilers, but would flop back and forth between the AHL and NHL. He would have a pretty successful season in 2010, getting 37 points, 17 goals in 65 games, but at that point he had plateaued and was unable to find the consistency nor the health to sustain his NHL career. I think if Brule played today and had better health throughout his career, he could have been an impact forward. I just think he was a part of a bygone era where it was so incredibly hard to make as a smaller player, and Brule just did not have the capacity nor the health to be able to make it. Going on to the 2006 NHL draft, which is also a pretty great one, having top-end players like Giroux, Backstrom, Kessel, Marchand, Jonathan Toews, and more. But to me, by far the worst draft pick of the bunch was James Sheppard, a 9th overall pick by the Minnesota Wild. I think Sheppard was just another case of a mishandled draft pick. He was somebody in 2006 that was looking like a great power forward in the future and would play one more season in the QMJHL, getting 96 points in 56 games. But then Minnesota would put him directly in the NHL. They were desperate for offense at that point, but he just wasn't the player at that point in his career to be able to put up massive numbers. And you can see his first couple of seasons in the NHL, 19 points, 24 points. It's not horrendous, but it's not the perfect amount that you want to see. And the next season, he would play 64 games in his last season with Minnesota and got just 6 points to show for it. And afterwards, he bounced between the AHL and the NHL in the Sharks system, had a couple of okay seasons, got 20 points in 2014, but after 2015 would go right to Europe and would never come back. I think Sheppard's interesting because if he had more development time, I think he could have been a really consistent player, but I don't think he was ever going to be this great offensive producer. Watching him, he was an okay scorer, but really the strongest traits were the physical prowess, the protection of the puck, the play along the boards. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the Minnesota Wild's pick in Charlie Stramel in the first round a couple of years back, where the offense might not be there, but there's some great pro attributes. But Sheppard just was not able to translate that to consistent NHL success, being brought to the NHL in a role almost immediately. And unfortunately, in Sheppard's case, I think he was another prospect that was rushed, and that ultimately ruined a player's career. Now on to the 2007 NHL draft, and in the middle of players like Patrick Kane, James Van Riemsdyk, Jakub Voracek, and Logan Couture stood the 8th overall pick by the Boston Bruins in Zach Hamill. It's honestly pretty impressive just how much Zach Hamill dropped off the face of the earth. As a prospect that was a draft pick just before Logan Couture, he was somebody that was electric in his junior days. He got 93 points in 69 games back in 2007 with Everett, which would lead the WHL as a draft eligible. But as you can see, he kind of toiled away at the pro level, not really making too much of an impression at the AHL level, and whenever he was given opportunity in the NHL, he really didn't do much with it. His biggest opportunity came in 2012, where he played 16 games, getting 2 assists for 2 points with 0 goals. And 7 years after he was drafted, he's right to Russia, then playing in Europe to play out his hockey days. But honestly, he really wasn't even that good of a player overseas. He had a good season in the Liga, I guess you could say, in 2015, but just a couple years later, he'd be playing in the second tier of German hockey. Not where you want to be. I think the biggest issues for Zach Hamill related to skating and the size that he has. Again, this was still a pretty tough era of hockey, and at 5'11", 181 pounds, the big weakness for Hamill was the skating speed. It was a lack of pure pace, and especially when you're a smaller player like that, you need to be able to create yourself and to get past opposition. With Hamill, he was a little bit just too one-dimensional to make it happen. And in the era where the Bruins didn't make too many bad picks, Zach Hamill was by far the biggest stain. Going on to probably the highest profile bust yet, though. In 2007, the big one was Nikita Filatov, another bad 6th overall pick by the Columbus Blue Jackets. Filatov was just a disappointment in so many ways. Somebody that in terms of pure skill was electric and absolutely a top 5 player in that draft, but another guy in a long list of guys who just didn't have the work ethic to put in to make himself an NHL player. It's honestly kind of embarrassing just how much Filatov went back and forth. He was in North America, then in Russia, then back in North America, then back to Russia, and would just ping pong across different team and different team. Nobody wanted to deal with this guy. And with all the stories we've heard, it makes a lot of sense. You go all the way back to the 2007 draft, and Alan Cheney, who was a part of the Ducks scouting staff during those seasons, had a great story about Filatov. He said that Filatov asked scouts, "What pick do you guys have?" They told him that they had the 12th overall pick, and Filatov answered, "I am a projected top 5 pick. Why are you interviewing me?" That really just shows all you need to know about Nikita Filatov and why he failed in the NHL. The lack of respect, responsibility for himself, and work ethic needed to become an NHLer. You can have all the talent possible, but when you have the mentality of Filatov, you'll go nowhere. And it's kind of impressive that he had, what, one good season in the KHL, getting 40 points in 2017. Besides that, Filatov was a dud almost everywhere he went, and it's a shame, man, because he was talented. Now, the 2009 first round had some great picks like John Tavares, Victor Hedman, but a lot of it had some weird picks, and this one, unfortunately, hits very close to home, as the worst pick ended up being at 8th overall, with my Dallas Stars taking Scott Glennie. Scott Glennie is a very unfortunate case, someone that absolutely had potential as this strong goal-scoring winger. He was somebody that in his draft year got 70 points in 55 games and had a great playoff run too, getting 18 points in 12 games. But a lot of that definitely was inflated by the team around him. You had Braden Shen as an absolute top-tier caliber talent alongside Jay Fair, Andrew Clark, Matt Lowry, Matt Calvert, some really good talents that Scott Glennie was really benefiting from. But really the big thing that held Scott Glennie back was just a multitude of injuries. Groin, concussion, hand, pretty much everywhere around your body you could have injuries, Scott Glennie had them, and it really kept him from being an impact player, especially once he hit the pro level. And he wouldn't even be one of those players that tries to make it overseas because he just did not have the capacity to do it health-wise. He was somebody that was decent in the AHL, but after it was obvious that he wouldn't be long-term a player in the NHL, he just stopped playing, and honestly, with the injuries he had mounting over him, you could see why. He's a sad case, but like a lot of Stars' first-round draft picks during this era, it was another long line of failures that Glennie ended up being, unfortunately. Next up, going on to the 2010 NHL draft, and this one also featured some pretty high picks that didn't end up panning out too much, like Jack Campbell and Brandon Gormley, but to me, the worst out of the bunch was absolutely the New York Rangers selecting Dylan McIllrath 10th overall. McIllrath, I'm sorry to say, was just never that great of a pick to begin with. He was somebody in 2010 that was an imposing physical defenseman, but that was what he was best at. He still had some major weaknesses in his skating ability and speed, getting out of his own zone, and I think that'll be the biggest weakness for him going forward. He would actually play a couple games this last year with Washington, which was pretty miraculous, but he's most likely an AHL journeyman for the most part. I think McIllrath is part of an era where they drafted physical defensemen just because they're violent and not really much else, and you could tell with the skating ability that McIllrath just lacked and the lack of pace that he was able to create that he wasn't going to be much else than a hitter. Nowadays, we're starting to see defensemen bring a lot more to the table with their skating ability and their transition ability, and McIllrath was just never a defenseman that brought that. Unfortunately, I think the Rangers and the draft type around him was just setting him up for failure because he was never this top-end defenseman that he was drafted to be. I hope that he can somehow carve a future in the NHL someday as a stay-at-home D, but that's the most he's ever going to be. And at 10th overall, the pick just was way too high for him and set him up for lofty expectations that he simply couldn't meet. Now going on to the 2011 NHL draft, and there weren't any extremely high-profile draft busts. The top 10 was pretty robust, the worst pick maybe being Ryan Strome. That's how good it was. But after that top 10, to me, the worst pick was absolutely Duncan Siemens, who was the 11th overall pick by the Avs at the time. I think Siemens is a good case of defenseman who does a couple of things decently, but doesn't have the overall tools to be able to make it in this show. He's somebody that in 2011 put up some decent numbers with Saskatoon, June, 43 points in 72 games, but he was always most likely going to be a more physical defenseman. Really, the big strength for him was actually the skating. Compared to McIllrath, he was a pretty smooth skater, especially around his own net. That was the major strength there. But I just don't think he had the defensive consistency or really was able to use his body in a great way to be able to become this elite shutdown defenseman. And he also had hands of complete stone. I mean, throughout his entire career, he was beating everyone to a pulp that he possibly could. And I think it affected his health, his hands, his ability to move the puck. And that was a major weakness. You could get some decent physical play and some big fights from him, but you weren't able to depend on him transporting the puck or keeping up with NHL pace. And unfortunately, he just was never able to stick. And after 2019 and a bunch of seasons just fighting and doing nothing in the AHL, the writing was on the wall and Siemens ended up retiring. Now, of course, we go on to the fabled 2012 NHL draft. And of course, this is multiple NHL busts. You could go over, I mean, you could make a whole video about the draft busts in this draft, especially in the first round. But of course, the most notable has to be Nail Yakupov. We talked about him a lot on this channel, but another player that just, it seemed like didn't have the work ethic nor the maturity to stick at the NHL level and get better at his craft. Somebody that had incredible talents, and I think in the OHL was a stupendous player. I mean, in his first year, he got 101 points in 65 games in Sarnia. There was potential there, and he had a couple of decent seasons. His rookie season with Edmonton was pretty strong, but outside of that, just did not have the consistency nor the overall game to stick in the NHL like he probably should have. Now we go on to absolutely one of the more unfortunate cases on this list, to the 2013 NHL draft, with the most notable draft bust being Samuel Morin, drafted 11th overall by Philly. This one I'm honestly pretty sad about because Morin, I thought, had some pretty good potential as a defensive defenseman. Good skating ability, was pretty consistent at what he did. And in the QMJHL, even though I think he was drafted way too early, was still somebody on track to be a productive NHLer. But the big problems were a lack of offensive development and really, unfortunately, a bulk of injuries, especially with his knee. He tore his ACL twice during his career and would basically be forced to retire in 2022. But man, injuries really kept him from being able to do anything in the NHL with Philly, and it's one of the players in this list that I feel for the most. Now going on to the 2014 NHL draft, and there are a lot of options inside the top 10 among draft busts. You had players like Jake Virtanen and Hayden Fleury, but to me, absolutely the worst ended up being Michael Dal Colle, 5th overall pick by the Isles. Michael Dal Colle was a pretty special case. He was an electric junior player. We're talking about insane production with Oshawa, 95 points in his draft year in 67 games. Then the year after, he had 93 points in 56 games and 42 goals. That was also topped by a playoff run that saw 31 points in 21 games, and obviously Dal Colle was proving himself in the OHL. And you can even see in his first year in the AHL, he was actually pretty decent, getting 41 points in 75 games, but even though he would still improve in the point totals, that was really all he was doing. He wasn't improving on his major weaknesses, which were really rampant. Even though he was a big forward with great skill, he was somebody that had a major weakness, and that was skating. It was inefficient, it was clunky, and especially for his size, it meant that generating speed, going up the ice, he just was not able to be a deceptive player or somebody that was able to keep up with the pro and especially the NHL pace. At a certain point, Dal Colle just became an inadaptable player who wasn't really getting much better at his weaknesses and also wasn't proving himself to play up to that NHL pace. And he's gone, of course, now overseas after trying to make it in North America, now in the DEL, which as a European player is probably where he belongs. Unfortunately, it's just one of those prospects that ended up stagnating. A lot of the process when you're looking and developing prospects is trying to make them see that extra gear, to capitalize on it, get better in every single area. And in Dal Colle's case, it just felt like he hit a wall eventually and wasn't the player that he needed to be. I don't think he ever would have been the player the Islanders wanted because of that lack of skating ability, and they would kind of make the same mistake with Oliver Wahlstrom a few years later. Now we move on to 2015, one of the best drafts in recent memory, but even though it was incredible, it wasn't exempt from draft busts. Some people might say that Jakub Zboril would be the pick here, but at least he's in North America, still playing in the AHL. You cannot say the same about Zach Senyshyn. Saying the 2015 draft sucked for the Boston Bruins is just putting more salt on the wound that has already been salted for years and years, but Zach Senyshyn especially is the pick that did not work out. draft. I think Senyshyn, kind of like a Dylan McIllrath, was another player that was just drafted higher than he really should have been. I mean, you look back in 2015, and he was an okay player for the Sioux Greyhounds, getting 26 goals, 45 points in 66 games, but was somebody that just hadn't really proven himself. I mean, he was 40th on Bob McKenzie's board that year, going 15th overall, and it's not a surprise that it ended up being a reach like that. I think Senyshyn is one of those weird players that had a lot of skill first and was able to be a great goal scorer immediately, but was somebody that once he hit the pros was trying to transition into more of this grinding type player to make it to the NHL, and just wasn't as good of a defensive player or physical presence with his size that needed to be to actually fill one of those roles. And it's pretty obvious to see why he didn't end up working in the NHL. Wasn't skilled enough or quick enough to be that top end player, and not grinding enough to be in that bottom six that Boston really wanted at the time, and now he's in Germany doing his thing over there. But hey, at least the Bruins got Jake DeBrusk from that draft, right? Right? They still have him, right? Now on to 2016, and the highest profile one by far is when the Vancouver Canucks took Olli Juolevi 5th overall. Juolevi was another one that was drafted higher than he should have been, but not by too much at the time. I mean, he was a pretty highly regarded D prospect, and somebody that in his first year in the OHL put up some pretty great numbers, especially in the playoffs. 14 points in 18 games, not too bad, and on top of a good World Juniors too, it was expected that he would go inside the top 10. But Juolevi would be another prospect that would kind of grow a little bit stagnant. He would go to the Liga after the OHL, then back to North America, but would have major injury setbacks, and I think those are the big things that kept Juolevi from being an NHLer in the future, being somebody that could log NHL minutes. I think that was the bare minimum for him if he was healthy. I don't think Juolevi was ever a star prospect or somebody that put up massive potential. I think the value in him was always the way he processed the ice, the quick decisions he made, and especially up the ice, the good passing ability they did have. Nothing was special with Juolevi, but I feel like he always could have been a solid NHLer. But man, those injuries were really at the worst times, and it really held them back from getting much of an opportunity with Vancouver. Really does suck though when you take a look at it. Then the next two picks after him were Matthew Tkachuk and Clayton Keller. Ouch. Now we go into the 2017 NHL draft, and there are a lot of options from this one. Obviously, Nolan Patrick is the highest profile one, but a lot of that was migraine issues and injuries that really set him back, and not really a lot to do with him. If we're talking about busts that really wasted all the potential they had with health, to me, it's Lias Andersson, 7th overall by the New York Rangers. To me, Andersson is a pretty special case of a very individual player that was not able to build the overall pro game he needed, especially at the NHL level. There were times where he was a great AHL player and put up some massive numbers. I mean, these last couple of seasons are a great example of it. But whenever he'd come into the NHL, he would never be able to show the offense worthy enough of forgetting the defensive mistakes and the lack of physical pressure and just the lack of real production and consistency and any real cohesion up the ice. He's somebody that I think just lacked a lot of the NHL game, had a lot of NHL talent, but offensively was not able to put it together enough to warrant the issues. Which sucks, especially with how good his year was after he was drafted. Some great numbers in both the SHL, AHL, and World Juniors. There was a lot to like there, but unfortunately, just did not work out. And for the Rangers especially, did not work out whatsoever. And unfortunately, in the very next draft, the New York Rangers would make once again the biggest mistake, drafting Vitaly Kravtsov 9th overall. You could make the case that Filip Zadina is a bigger bust considering the hype he had around him, but also he's at least had a couple of NHL worthy production seasons, getting 24 points last year and 23 points this year. In Kravtsov's case, there's really nothing to go off here. He was a 9th overall pick, and production-wise was looking incredible, especially in 2019. 29 points in 50 games there, really started to adapt well to the KHL level, but he was another player that kind of bounced back and forth all the time. He went from the AHL to Russia, to the AHL to Russia, then back to North America, and then now, of course, back to Russia, and never really found his footing. I think Kravtsov is another one of those players that was great in the individual moments and had some things to work off with his motor and IQ, but considering the shorter ice, the smaller ice in North America that he had to deal with, I just don't think he had the pace, the speed, and the quick decision making to be able to be an NHL talent. He had the frame and he had some moments here and there, but it just never seemed to work out. And even when he did get opportunities, he was always just fine at best, which really sucked because it felt like Kravtsov was really building towards something, but whenever he'd come back to North America, it would just slow back down. Now, with the 2019 draft, we're starting to get into the territory where I'm a little bit hesitant to call these guys busts completely, though I think in the 2019 draft, the biggest option here is absolutely Alex Turcotte, drafted 5th overall to LA. This one really hurts because I was a big Alex Turcotte fan in his draft year. He was somebody I ranked 3rd overall in my rankings, if I believe, and someone that I just love the IQ, the driven possession playing hockey. He was somebody that just had great physical traits already, even if he wasn't the biggest player, but was so smart in how he used his body, so smart in how he protected the puck, and I think he was somebody that just had so much potential with the way he played the game. But like a lot of other prospects on this list, injuries have really held him back. He honestly might be one of the most unlucky players on this list because he's somebody that just had so much talent all the way through, but would just, whenever he'd get that NHL opportunity, couldn't really capitalize on it, and the injuries in the AHL just mounted and mounted. And hopefully this next year he's a full-time NHLer. I would really like to see that happen, but because of the injuries and because of the health, I doubt he'll ever be close to the draft pedigree he once had. And it's also pretty obvious, especially since this draft year, that Turcotte hasn't been able to add that next gear to his offensive game, hasn't been able to find the pace that he probably needed to get past those injuries and the lack of a great build at the NHL level. And maybe he's still able to do that, but I think that's the biggest reason why we haven't seen Turcotte become an established NHL producer. The lack of pace and the injuries can really hurt you. Now, continuing on to guys that I'm not going to call full busts yet, but I wanted to mention in this video, the closest in 2020 as of right now is Alexander Holtz, who recently got traded from the Devils to the Vegas Golden Knights this last offseason. And I think he's somebody that I still think could rebound with Vegas, and I think this next year is really a make or break season for him. But he's kind of gone in a weird trajectory so far, like a lot of goal-scoring first prospects that don't have a lot more else to their game. He's somebody that's failed to adapt completely to the NHL level and especially gain coaches' trust. He's somebody that I thought played pretty well given his role this last year, getting 28 points, 16 goals in 82 games, but he's someone that you really need to shelter quite a bit. Even though he has great a shot and he's been developing the speed to his game, he's somebody that does have some pretty big drawbacks defensively, and obviously physically he's not going to be this gifted physical talent that you might want him to be. You have some good traits there, but because the weakness is, he's kind of been held back so far. Now we're going to go to the 2021 draft, and this is the final draft I'm going to talk about today because I think it is far too early to even mention anybody from 2022, 2023, or 2024, obviously. But I think in the 2021 draft, we have a couple of players that might be trending towards that direction. First things first, Tyler Boucher, who I was never a big fan of. Adding an offensive game to him that just wasn't there. He's been toiling away in different leagues throughout the NCAA, OHL, and this last year risen up to the AHL level after injuries and just was not the player that he needed to be immediately to deter me from having him on this list. Maybe he's able to rebound next year, but really this next year is a make or break season for him. A player that's also trending towards the bust direction, but for different reasons, is Chaz Lucius, who's kind of the opposite player, a little bit softer, but has some great offensive talent, especially individually, but has had some massive injury issues that have really kept him back. He actually got off to a pretty good start in the AHL this season, but then had season-ending injuries, and hopefully he's able to recapture what he once had, but man, he has been through the ringer, and I would be surprised if he's a top 6 talent still. And then the final one I'll mention is actually somebody that just got recently traded in Xavier Bourgault, somebody that coming out of the QMJHL has failed to adapt to the AHL level completely yet, somebody that took a pretty big step down after an okay rookie season in the AHL in 2023. This last year getting 20 points in 55 games, getting less responsibility, not a lot of really trust in him at the AHL level. Bakersfield, he is now in a new system in Ottawa, and that could be something that maybe changes his trajectory. But I just feel like with the way he's played, with the skill first game he has, it's not really much of a surprise the pros have come really hard for him. But those are some of the biggest draft busts over the last couple of decades, especially with some of the more recent players. There still is a wait to see factor with those, so don't judge them too harshly yet. But I wanted to talk about some of the recent guys and some of the old players that had not worked in the NHL, and it's really for a multitude of different reasons. I mean, it's kind of interesting to see the vast reasons why these guys haven't worked out, whether it be because of age, of talent, of expectations. So many reasons why players players just can't make it in the NHL, but hopefully it can teach us lessons for the future to try and spot these cases and adjust accordingly. So if you guys enjoyed, make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and comment down below what are your thoughts on all of these guys. Who do you think is the biggest bust out of them all, and who do you think maybe deserve better in their hockey career? I'd love to know your thoughts down below, y'all. And of course, make sure you share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online, and click on this card for all of my hockey prospects talk right in one playlist. My name is Nathan, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a great hockey day, and goodbye.